Okay, so love isn't always about light, and attraction is not always healthy. Sometimes the very things that we actually crave in relationships are also the things that keep us stuck in painful cycles. So, Mars and Venus are the planets that show us our desires and our attractions. And it also shows us what we want when it comes to love. But they also expose the shadow dynamics of where we have fear of intimacy, where we have unmet needs, and what are the types of wounds that we carry when it comes to relationships. So we find ourselves always recognizing that we attract the same unconscious patterns in relationships. And we always find ourselves struggling to kind of break out of these patterns. And I suppose the question that's probably the most important is, how do we actually grow and evolve beyond them? So this video, what I'm going to do is talk more deeply about how Mars and Venus's shadow elements play out through our lives, and what are the possibilities and potentials that we can gain from understanding the shadow qualities of our Mars and Venus more deeply. So Mars and Venus operate like this from a healthy and unhealthy perspective. Mars is the part of us that says, I want to take up space here. I want to make choices from my desires, and I want to grow and engage in life. When Mars is operating from a shadow perspective, it's the part of us that either is completely avoidant of life and don't want to take up space anywhere, the fear of rejection, or it can operate in the other way, where we overly dominate. We take up way too much space. We're highly impulsive and aggressive. From the Venus perspective, what it does is it shows us what's the things that we want to attract in our relationships, right? From our sense of self-worth and from our sense of what we think is valuable in terms of give and take, Venus represents to us this natural balancing and attractive function. Of course, when it's operating more from the shadow elements, this is the parts of us through an insecurity or feelings of insecurity that we can either become overly dependent and lose ourselves in relationships. And it also shows us exactly where we become overly accommodating, right? And these are the things that gets us trapped in unhealthy patterns. So Mars and Venus are the two planets that, through a dynamic tension of action and attraction, we find ourselves growing and relating. But when they're operating from a distorted place and the shadow elements are present, that's where these cycles of wounding and unhealthy behaviorisms and patterns actually reveal themselves and keep us in these cycles that are unhealthy for us. So let's take a deeper dive into the types of ways that Mars and Venus, through these shadow elements, actually show up for us. So Mars has three ways that it generally expresses itself in a shadow perspective. The first one is the fear of losing control. And as we know, Mars is the part of us that takes up space, we make choices and we act on our desires, and it leads us in a direction, right? We can make connection through that. But when it's operating from a distorted perspective, often this can lead to a sense of aggression, over dominance, and this creates power struggles. When Mars is operating from this fear of losing control, it's ultimately stemming from a vulnerability place. And so when people, or I'm sure you've probably had this before, and when people are operating from a place of fearing losing control, they assert themselves into the experience, right? The energy asserts themselves into the experience. And this leads to an overly dominant expression, and it actually breaks down closeness because there is no ability for a fair exchange of the way that things can happen. It's always one way, and that's how it is. So very dominating. And oftentimes people can actually attract, who have this fear of losing control, they can attract emotionally unavailable people because they themselves struggle with their own emotional vulnerability. And so they also are fearing that loss of control, and they can attract these types of people into their lives. Another way that Mars will express itself in a shadow way is through the fear of vulnerability that looks like avoidance, like completely avoiding any form of emotional interaction. And this is really because it operates from a place of not wanting to carry emotional responsibility, right? And so what happens here is that you often see the expression of like love being more of an intellectualized experience or a philosophical intake, an inquiry, rather than the opening and sharing and engagement of carrying the emotional responsibility of what it's like to emotionally grow and mature. So again, the type of ways that will express itself is through, overindulgence in work or distractions, but never really feeling emotionally available. So this is the type of Mars expression that can often lead people to attract a type of relationship and get very connected to it very quickly, and it's it's all engaged, and then all of a sudden, as soon as there's a moment of openness and seriousness and realness, they sort of go. And it's like they disengage and they're out of there. It's avoiding that. And again, it's because of the struggle to carry that emotional responsibility. The third way that Mars can actually express itself through a shadow dynamic is through the consistent repetitive pattern of attracting a relationship or a cycle or a type of cycle into your life that's just the same thing over and over. And this actually happens because there's an underlying need to resolve something within your psyche or within the person's psyche. And so this leads to constantly attracting relationships where there's a very strong theme of the other person has this pattern and you're feeling as if it's happening to you, right? It's more of like they have strong boundaries and that affects you in a way, right? You're struggling with that, or they have very strong needs, they can express them. It's often always that the other person mirrors a very strong core pattern or characteristic that you struggle to kind of meet. And this is actually because underlying in the psyche, there's a desire to attract these types of people so that you yourself can then begin to show up in that space too. Remember, Mars is the part of us that's showing us where we're taking up space and growing into and asserting ourselves in a way that's healthy. So when we learn through this consistent repetitive pattern that the people that we might attract consistently are actually here to reveal what is trying to be developed within yourself. So Mars can actually reveal to us and show us where the parts of ourselves are wanting to grow and evolve, and we can attract these types of patterns within our lives. So there are going to be three ways that Venus will also express itself in a shadow dynamic. Right? The first one actually is the need for external validation. And this is where Venus, through its distortion, will not see its own self-worth. And so the struggle to acknowledge its own existence, to validate its own needs, leads to creating relationships that are only dependent, right? Where the relationship connection is forged based on the dependency of that external validation and acknowledgement. And of course, you can see all the types of dilemmas that can come from this. Venus is the part of us that reveals to us where our self-worth is and how we can see that self-worth and express it within the context of a relationship. But when it's operating from that distorted perspective, what happens is that the relationship ultimately becomes a pattern of fulfilling the void, where that absence of our own self is missing. And so the relationship becomes an extension of ourselves, right? It becomes an extension of the Venus patterning. So I'm sure you've probably seen somebody or been in that type of relationship where you stay in the relationship, or the person stays in the relationship that's not healthy for them because it's fulfilling that feeling of avoiding being alone, right? Or, not being part of a relationship where that feeling of the void is not fulfilled. Another way that Venus will express itself in a shadow quality is through fantasy and the illusion of love. And this can be a difficult one and often expressed through all of us because we always carry within ourselves an underlying desire or ideal that will stop us from seeing the actual relationship and what it's really about. Oftentimes we can miss red flags, or we can miss certain patterns because we're projecting onto it an illusion of something, right? And this creates a type of connection that ultimately will break down and lead to some pretty intense breakups, because the reality versus the illusion collide. Now, where this type of relationship tends to happen is, and again, maybe you've happened to your life or you've seen it with somebody, that it's about seeing the potential or the possibility or what is that you want to see, and then that sort of crisis moment comes in, and you realize that you were wanting to see that rather than the reality of the situation. The third way that Venus will show up in a shadow format, right, is a sort of overgiving and oversharing pattern that often leads to resentment. And I suspect that this is something that's actually pretty common in the collective. Venus often can, through this patterning, reveal where there is a need to prove love, right? To prove that you are valuable, to prove that there is a sense of meaning, value, or connection. And so this often comes through sacrificing your own needs as a way to maintain the relationship, which can be an incredibly powerful thing. And oftentimes this comes from a part of ourselves where we don't know how to express our own needs, or we suppress the needs as a way to keep or maintain the relationship because it creates harmony. Unfortunately, this is the type of pattern that happens with a lot of homes where the original connection between the parents wasn't formed yet, or wasn't really good. And so you become overly dependent on the relationship, and you put your own needs away, and you prioritize giving as a way, as I said, to keep the relationship healthy. But this, again, forms a connection that is imbalanced and ultimately leads to feelings of aloneness and isolation and resentment. So part of this patterning also is, just like with Mars, where we might attract these types of relationships as a way to have to discover that personal power within ourselves, right? That personal realization that we need to meet our own needs and to come into that agency. So Mars, or should this say in this case, Venus, is the part of us that teaches us where love is for us, but it also shows us exactly where we ourselves are learning how to overcome some of the patterns where we might overgive or project an illusion, or we're learning about our self-worth. If we don't address these shadow dynamics or wounds, we'll keep recreating the same relationship patterns over and over. Mars's distortions just lead you to chase relationships from past trauma, and Venus's distortions just keep you in relationship patterns that are unhealthy for you and don't reflect your self-worth. Relationships are like mirrors, right? They bring us the things that we want to develop and grow within ourselves. Mars helps us not act from fear, but act from a state of truth. And Venus is helping you become more conscious of where you're finding love for yourself rather than seeking the external validation. And if you find yourself like stuck in these looping patterns, it's the soul's way of saying, hey, here's something that needs to be developed or consciously understood or brought to the surface so that you can psychologically integrate it within yourself. Okay, so we've looked at the shadow dilemmas that come along with Mars and Venus. And we recognized that unless we identified the wounds that kept playing out for us, we weren't able to actually grow past these patterns. And that relationships are mirrors for us to help us identify these patterns so we can grow beyond them. So here's a 4-step process that can help frame a way of connecting to these patterns and starting the process for you to begin moving in a direction that helps you empower your Mars and Venus. So step 1 would be to identify your Mars and Venus shadows. By doing this and being able to recognize, are you noticing the fear of rejection that's coming from the Venus element, or you're waiting for the validation of the other person? Are you acting out of the avoidance pattern of the Mars energy? Are you chasing relationships not out of desire or attraction that's right for you, but making it just because you need to fill the void? Firstly, identify where these shadows are. Step 2 then would be to reflect back on past relationships or the current relationship that you have and notice where these patterns are playing out consistently. Where are they showing up? And what is recurring? That's an important one, right? If you can identify what's recurring, it gives you the ability to then be able to pinpoint and locate, and you can start to understand where you're acting out of the natural authentic expression or the shadow distortion. Step 3 is the shadow work and the self-integration, right? You have to be able to recognize the fears that are behind the relationship struggles, right? What are the fears behind the actual behavior? So with Mars, it's the fear of asserting your truth, right? It's the fear of standing up and taking up space and having that courage to say, this is who I am, right? Because of course that can lead to rejection. The Venus part is the fear of rejection or loss. So this is the loss of your own self-connection or the rejection of your own self-connection. These are the types of patterns that will be the fears behind these relationship shadows. Now, once you've recognized the fear behind them, you can then take the next step and the fourth step, and this is where you can begin to reframe it for you and work towards things that actually, or patterns that actually are the opposite. So if it's the Venus wound that you have, right, practice more self-acceptance and more self-compassion. Recognize that you need to be prioritizing your needs and understanding your needs and validating them first. And also then being able to work on and valuing boundary making, right? So grow in that area. If it's the Mars wound, recognize that this is about practicing healthy assertion. This is about taking up space, learning how to take up space, and coming into an experience and validating who you are. So relationship patterns aren't just always about love, right? They're about our evolution. And each connection that we actually make is a mirror that helps us understand ourselves on a deeper level, helps us grow and emotionally mature. I'd love to hear in the comment section what types of patterns you've recognized within yourself, or what are the types of dilemmas that have played out for you and that you've noticed in your relationships. And for those of you that are wanting to go deeper into this Mars and Venus exploration, don't forget the masterclass that's happening on the 2nd of March. If you go down to the description, you'll see a link. I've left it there. Just sign up for that. It's for free. And I'm going to be talking about the importance of Mars and Venus and thinking about it from a perspective of the blueprint that it brings within our birth chart. So make sure you check that out. And for those of you that haven't watched the Venus retrograde video on the screen right now, you will see it come up. Click on that and enjoy that video.